when a waitress noticed the black girl's strange behavior. She decided to call 911, and the events that followed shocked everyone. Write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. The small American diner on the outskirts of town hummed with the familiar rhythm of a new day. The sun had barely risen, casting long golden beams across the linoleum floor and illuminating the red vinyl booths. The faint crackle of bacon sizzling on the griddle mixed with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Aisha, a young black woman with a warm smile and quick wit, moved through the diner with practiced ease. She balanced a pot of coffee in one hand and a tray of freshly baked muffins in the other, greeting each customer as if they were old friends. The morning regulars had already claimed their usual spots. Mr. Hensley, an elderly man engrossed in his morning paper, a young mother trying to corral her energetic toddler, and two truck drivers swapping stories over stacks of syrup-drenched pancakes. Aisha loved the mornings. They were predictable, full of small, comforting rituals. She had worked at the diner for nearly 3 years, and while it wasn't where she had envisioned herself, it paid the bills and offered a sense of community. Most mornings, she allowed herself to dream of opening her own little bakery someday, a cozy spot filled with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla, where locals could gather over warm pastries and conversation. She wiped down a booth by the window, glancing at the clock. It was only 8:15 a.m., and the day stretched ahead, promising nothing out of the ordinary. Or so she thought. The bell above the door jingled, pulling Aisha's attention toward the entrance. A man stepped inside, holding the door open for a young girl trailing behind him. He was tall and white, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt tucked neatly into pressed slacks. His hair was meticulously combed, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. The man had an air of confidence that seemed almost performative, as if he was consciously commanding attention. The girl was a sharp contrast. She was small, no older than 7 or 8, with deep brown skin and tightly coiled hair tied into 2 uneven puffs. Her clothes, though clean, were slightly oversized, as if hastily chosen from a thrift store rack. She clutched a small backpack close to her chest and kept her eyes fixed on the floor, her shoulders hunched inward like a turtle retreating into its shell. "Good morning," Aisha greeted them with her usual cheer, her eyes darting between the man and the girl. "Table for 2?" The man nodded curtly, his thin lips barely twitching into what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Yes, please, by the window, if you don't mind." Aisha led them to a booth near the front of the diner, setting down 2 menus before stepping back to let them settle in. The man helped the girl into the booth, his hand resting on her shoulder for just a second longer than necessary. Aisha noticed the way the girl flinched at his touch, though she quickly masked it by adjusting her backpack. "I'll be right back to take your order," Aisha said, forcing a smile as she walked away. Something about the pair unsettled her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Back behind the counter, Aisha poured 2 cups of coffee for the truck drivers, all the while sneaking glances at the booth by the window. The man had opened his menu, scanning it with an air of disinterest. The girl, however, didn't touch hers. She sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the tabletop. When Aisha returned to their table, notepad in hand, she offered them another smile. "Have you decided what you'd like?" "I'll have the full breakfast plate," the man said without looking up. "Eggs scrambled, bacon crispy, and a side of toast, and coffee, black." He paused, glancing at the girl. "What about you, sweetheart?" The girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted toward Aisha, wide and pleading, before quickly returning to the table. "She'll have pancakes," the man said smoothly, answering for her. "And orange juice?" "Got it," Aisha said, jotting down the order. "Anything else?" "No, that'll be all," he replied, folding the menu and handing it back to her. His tone was polite, but there was an edge to it, a warning not to linger. Aisha nodded and walked back to the kitchen, her unease growing with every step. As she pinned the order to the carousel for the cook, Aisha couldn't shake the image of the girl's eyes. They were dark and full of something she couldn't quite name. Fear, maybe, or sadness. There was something hauntingly familiar about the look, something that tugged at the edges of Aisha's memory. She glanced back toward the booth. The man was scrolling through his phone, completely ignoring the girl, who now sat motionless, her hands still folded in her lap. Aisha noticed how tightly she gripped her fingers, her knuckles pale against her skin. When she finally moved, it was to reach for her glass of water. As she lifted it to her lips, her sleeve slipped back, revealing a faint dark mark on her wrist. Aisha froze. The mark looked like a bruise. It was faint, as if it had begun to fade, but its presence sent a chill down her spine. She turned away quickly, pretending to busy herself with refilling the salt shakers. Her mind raced. Maybe it was nothing. Kids get bruises all the time, falling off bikes, climbing trees, but something about this girl's demeanor told Aisha it wasn't that simple. Aisha's thoughts drifted to the news report she had seen just a few days ago. A little black girl had gone missing in a neighboring state. The description of the girl had been vague, around 7 years old, dark skin and short hair, but something about the story had stuck with her. Could it be the same girl? Was it even possible? She shook her head, chastising herself for jumping to conclusions. Still, the feeling of unease gnawed at her, refusing to be dismissed. Aisha resolved to keep an eye on the pair just in case. When the food was ready, she carried the plates to their table, setting them down with practiced efficiency. "Here you go," she said, placing the pancake platter in front of the girl. "Enjoy." The man nodded his thanks, but the girl said nothing. Aisha lingered for a moment, hoping the girl might look up or say something, but she remained silent. Aisha noticed her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her fork. As she turned to leave, Aisha's mind was a storm of questions. Who were these people? Why did the girl seem so afraid? And most importantly, what, if anything, should she do about it? She didn't know it yet, but this ordinary morning was about to change everything. The diner hummed with its usual morning energy, but for Aisha, the world outside her immediate focus seemed muted. Her thoughts circled back to the man and the girl in the booth by the window. Every time she glanced in their direction, the unease in her chest tightened its grip. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. The man was eating his breakfast methodically, barely acknowledging the girl. She sat with her fork hovering over the pancakes, cutting them into small pieces but not eating. Aisha watched as the girl's hand trembled slightly, her shoulders drawn tight as if she were trying to make herself invisible. The bruise on her wrist flashed in Aisha's mind like a warning light, fueling the nagging suspicion that refused to be silenced. She tried to focus on her work, refilling coffee mugs and clearing plates, but her eyes kept drifting back to the pair. The man's demeanor was composed, but there was something overly calculated in his movements. He spoke to the girl occasionally, his voice too low for Aisha to hear, but the girl's responses were either absent or barely perceptible nods. It wasn't the dynamic of a father and daughter, at least not any that Aisha had ever seen. When she approached their table to check in, she did so with her best professional smile, masking her growing anxiety. "Everything okay here? Can I get you anything else?" The man glanced up briefly. "We're fine, thank you." Aisha shifted her gaze to the girl. "How about you, sweetie? Everything good with your pancakes?" The girl opened her mouth as if to speak, but before she could make a sound, the man interjected. "She's fine," he said, his tone firm. He leaned slightly forward, his posture subtly blocking the girl from Aisha's line of sight. "She's just a little shy around strangers." Aisha nodded, but her smile faltered. There was something about the way he said it. Too practiced, too dismissive. The girl's body language told a different story. Shy wasn't the word for it. She was scared. "All right," Aisha said softly, stepping back. "Just let me know if you need anything." She walked away, but her mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, but she was also painfully aware of how delicate the situation was. What if she was wrong? What if this really was just an awkward family moment? She couldn't accuse a man of mistreating a child without evidence. It could backfire disastrously for both her and the diner. Her thoughts turned to the news report she'd seen. The missing girl. Could it be her? The similarities gnawed at her. The age, the skin tone, the hair, it all fit. But was it enough to act on? Her pulse quickened as she remembered the girl's name. Kayla. That was it. Kayla James. Aisha's unease deepened as she noticed the man checking his watch. He looked toward the door, then at his phone, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. His movements had an air of nervousness that contrasted sharply with his earlier confidence. He leaned across the table to speak to the girl, his tone hushed but forceful. Whatever he said made the girl shrink back further into the booth. Aisha's resolve hardened. She couldn't just stand by. Even if there was the slightest chance that this girl was in danger, she had to do something. But she needed to be smart about it. In a quiet moment, Aisha slipped into the back room and pulled out her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed 911, the weight of what she was about to do pressing heavily on her chest. The line connected, and a calm voice greeted her. "This is 911. What's your emergency?" Aisha took a deep breath. "Hi, this might sound strange, but I think there's a situation here at the diner where I work. There's a man with a little girl, and something about it doesn't feel right." She described the man and the girl in detail, emphasizing the bruise on the girl's wrist and her withdrawn demeanor. She mentioned the news report about the missing girl, her voice trembling as she spoke. The dispatcher asked a few clarifying questions, then assured her that officers were on their way. "Please, don't confront the man," the dispatcher warned. "Stay calm and let the officers handle it." Aisha hung up, her heart pounding. She peeked out from the kitchen, her gaze locking on the booth by the window. The man was still scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. The girl sat motionless, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. Aisha went through the motions of her work, her stomach churning with anxiety. She refilled coffee cups, cleared tables, and exchanged polite smiles with other customers, all the while keeping one eye on the booth. Finally, the bell above the door jingled. 2 police officers stepped inside, their presence immediately drawing attention. Aisha's breath hitched as she watched them scan the room before walking over to her. "Are you the one who called?" one of them asked, a tall man with a steady, reassuring voice. "Yes," Aisha whispered, nodding. She gestured subtly toward the booth. "That's them, the man and the little girl." The officers exchanged a glance before approaching the table. Aisha stayed near the counter, her heart pounding in her ears. She couldn't hear the conversation, but she saw the man straighten in his seat, his expression shifting to one of polite confusion. The girl remained still, her eyes fixed on her lap. The officers asked the man for his identification. He complied, pulling a driver's license from his wallet and handing it over with a calm smile. Aisha's chest tightened as she saw one of the officers crouch down to speak to the girl. The other officer checked the ID, his expression unreadable. The girl shook her head slightly, her lips pressed into a thin line. The officer leaned closer, speaking gently, and Aisha thought she saw the faintest glimmer of a tear in the girl's eye. Then, finally, the girl spoke. It was so quiet that Aisha couldn't hear it from where she stood, but whatever she said made the officer stiffen. He turned to his partner, who immediately placed a hand on the man's shoulder. The man's calm facade cracked. His voice rose, the sharp edges of panic cutting through the diner's hum. Aisha couldn't make out his words, but his gestures grew frantic, his face flushed with anger. The officers remained composed, but their stance was firm, their hands ready at their belts. Aisha felt her knees weaken as the officers led the man out of the diner, his protests echoing in her ears. The girl stayed behind, now surrounded by the warmth and reassurance of the officers. Relief washed over Aisha, but it was mixed with a new fear. What had this child been through, and what would come next? The diner felt unnaturally quiet in the wake of the man's departure. The usual clatter of dishes and hum of conversation had given way to hushed murmurs as customers whispered about the scene they had just witnessed. Aisha remained frozen near the counter, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the register. Her heart thudded in her chest as she watched the little girl sit alone in the booth, her hands tightly clasped together on the table. The two officers returned after ensuring the man was secured in their vehicle. One of them, a tall man with sandy blonde hair, approached Aisha while the other knelt beside the girl, speaking to her in a low, reassuring tone. "You did the right thing," the officer told Aisha, his voice steady but serious. "We're going to take her somewhere safe and get this sorted out." Aisha nodded, her throat too tight to form words. Her gaze flicked to the girl, who sat as still as a statue, her eyes glued to the surface of the table. Aisha's heart ached at the sight. She couldn't imagine the fear the child must have been feeling. The officer continued, "We're going to need a statement from you, but we'll take care of that later. For now, can you tell me what made you call us?" Aisha exhaled shakily, recounting everything she had observed. The girl's withdrawn behavior, the bruise on her wrist, the man's controlling demeanor, and the way he constantly cut her off from interacting with others. She also mentioned the news story about the missing girl, explaining why it had stuck in her mind. As she spoke, the officer nodded, occasionally jotting down notes in a small pad. "We're aware of the missing persons case," he said once she finished. "The description matches, but we'll need to confirm her identity. For now, your observations are incredibly helpful." While the officer spoke to Aisha, his partner was gently coaxing the girl to leave the booth. The girl hesitated, clutching her small backpack to her chest, her wide eyes darting around the diner. It wasn't until the officer extended his hand and whispered something to her that she slowly slid out of the seat. The moment the girl stood, Aisha noticed how small she looked, fragile like a bird with clipped wings. The child took a hesitant step toward the officer but stopped abruptly, her head swiveling toward the window. Her entire body tensed as she caught sight of the man outside, sitting rigidly in the back of the police car. Even through the glass, his presence seemed to loom over her like a shadow. "It's okay," the officer murmured, positioning himself between the girl and the window. "You're safe now." The girl's lips quivered, and for a moment Aisha thought she might cry, but instead she nodded almost imperceptibly and allowed herself to be led toward the door. Just as they reached the exit, the man in the squad car began to yell. His voice, muffled by the glass, still carried enough venom to make Aisha shudder. She couldn't make out the words, but his anger was palpable, a stark contrast to the composed facade he had worn earlier. The girl flinched at the sound, clutching the officer's hand tighter. The officer beside Aisha frowned deeply. "Stay here," he instructed before stepping outside to join his partner. Aisha watched through the window as the officers dealt with the man. He was thrashing against his restraints, his face contorted with rage as he shouted something at them. One of the officers bent down to speak to him through the open car door, while the other kept a protective hand on the girl's shoulder. It was then that Aisha caught a few words through the glass. "She should be thanking me," the man bellowed. "Do you know where she came from? I saved her." Aisha's stomach churned as his words grew more erratic, each sentence dripping with disdain. "She's better off with me than in some filthy ghetto. You think her kind has a future without someone like me?" The officer slammed the car door shut, cutting off the tirade. Aisha's hands trembled with anger. It was clear now, this wasn't just about control or power. It was about the man's deeply ingrained prejudice, his warped belief that he had the right to take and manipulate another human being for his own twisted sense of superiority. The officers returned, their expressions grim. The one who had spoken to Aisha before gave her a quick update. "We're taking him into custody. It'll take some time to sort everything out. But from what we've seen, this looks like a case of abduction." Aisha's breath caught. "So, she's the girl from the news? The one who went missing?" "We're not certain yet," the officer admitted, glancing at the girl who stood silently beside his partner. "But it's very likely. Either way, she's safe now." The officer gave Aisha a small nod of gratitude. "You did a brave thing today. If you hadn't called, who knows what might have happened." Aisha felt a swell of relief, but it was tempered by the weight of the situation. She looked at the girl, who was now sitting on a bench outside, waiting to be taken to a safe place. Her tiny frame seemed to fold in on itself, as if she were trying to disappear. "Can I?" Aisha hesitated, unsure of what she was asking. The officer nodded. "Go ahead, just keep it gentle. She's been through a lot." Aisha stepped outside, her heart pounding. She approached the bench slowly, crouching down to the girl's level. The child didn't look up, but her small hands fidgeted with the straps of her backpack. "Hey, sweetheart," Aisha said softly. "My name's Aisha. I just wanted to tell you, you're really brave." The girl's fingers stilled. After a moment, she raised her eyes to meet Aisha's. They were dark and full of unshed tears, but for the first time there was a glimmer of something else. Hope. "You're safe now," Aisha continued. "Those men will take care of you, and if you ever need anything, well, I'll be right here, okay?" The girl didn't say anything, but she gave a tiny nod. It was enough to make Aisha's throat tighten with emotion. As the police car pulled away, taking the man to a holding cell and the girl to safety, Aisha stood on the diner's steps, watching until they disappeared down the road. Her co-workers gathered around her, offering quiet words of support, but Aisha hardly heard them. Her thoughts were with the little girl and the darkness she had escaped. The day went on, the diner gradually returning to its usual rhythm, But Aisha couldn't shake the image of the girl's wide, frightened eyes. She'd done the right thing. Of that, she was certain. But the weight of it all lingered, a heavy reminder of the world's harsh realities. And yet, in that small nod from the girl, Aisha found a spark of light. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The following days at the diner passed in a haze of routine for Aisha, though her mind remained far from settled. Customers came and went, their chatter and laughter filling the space. But for Aisha, everything felt distant. The image of the little girl, small, scared, and clutching her backpack, lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. She replayed the events over and over, second-guessing every decision she had made. What if she had waited too long to call? What if the man had somehow convinced the police that nothing was wrong? Despite the officer's reassurances, Aisha couldn't help but feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. Her co-workers tried to offer support in their own ways. Lila, the head waitress, patted Aisha on the back during their shift change. "You did good, girl," she said with a small smile. "Not everyone would have had the guts to do what you did." Aisha nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but it didn't ease the knot in her chest. She couldn't help wondering what had become of the girl. Was she safe? Did she find her way back to her family? Aisha hadn't dared to ask the police for more details, afraid of what she might hear. 2 days after the incident, as Aisha was wiping down a table near the window, a voice broke her concentration. "Excuse me, miss?" She turned to see a woman standing near the counter, flanked by 2 men in suits. The woman had kind eyes, but her face was lined with exhaustion. One of the men carried a badge clipped to his belt, marking him as a detective. "You're Aisha, right?" the woman asked. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Yes," Aisha replied, setting down the rag. Her heartbeat quickened as she straightened up. "Can I help you?" The woman stepped closer, her expression both grateful and emotional. "I'm Detective Harper, and this is Agent Fields from the FBI. We wanted to personally thank you for your actions the other day." Aisha blinked, caught off guard. I didn't do much. I just made a phone call." Detective Harper shook her head. That phone call made all the difference. The girl, Kayla James, was indeed the child reported missing. She's been reunited with her family. The breath Aisha didn't realize she was holding escaped in a rush. Relief washed over her, leaving her momentarily speechless. She's okay?" she finally managed to ask. "She's safe now," Agent Fields said, his tone steady. "It'll take time for her to recover, but she's with her mother, and they're receiving the support they need." Aisha felt a lump rise in her throat. The image of Kayla sitting in the booth, so small and frightened, overlapped with the knowledge that the girl was now back where she belonged. "I'm glad," she whispered, her voice trembling. I couldn't ignore it. She looked so scared." Detective Harper nodded. "And because you didn't ignore it, you saved her from something much worse. The man who took her, Dale Riker, has a history of targeting vulnerable children. He's been on law enforcement's radar for years, but we could never catch him in the act. Until now." The name sent a chill down Aisha's spine. "What's going to happen to him?" she asked. Agent Fields exchanged a glance with the detective before answering. "He's facing multiple charges, including kidnapping and child endangerment. Given his past and the evidence we've collected, he's looking at a very long prison sentence." Aisha nodded, a small sense of justice settling over her. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened to Kayla, but it was something. Detective Harper hesitated before continuing. "Kayla's mother wanted to be here to thank you in person, but Kayla's still adjusting and they're focusing on her recovery. She did, however, leave this for you. She handed Aisha a small envelope. Aisha took it with trembling hands, her curiosity and apprehension swirling together. The detective offered a small smile. You don't have to open it now. Aisha nodded, clutching the envelope as the detectives left. She finished her shift in a daze, her thoughts consumed by the events of the past few days. When she finally got home that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the envelope as if it might burst into flames. Finally, she took a deep breath and opened it. Inside was a simple handwritten note. Dear Aisha, thank you for saving my daughter. Without you, I don't know where she'd be right now. You're her hero, and mine too. Kayla smiles again because of you. With all my gratitude, Denise James. Tears welled in Aisha's eyes as she read the words. She pressed the note to her chest, letting the emotions she had been holding back flow freely. For the first time in days, the tightness in her chest began to ease. She had done something good, something that mattered. The next morning, Aisha returned to the diner with a renewed sense of purpose. Life carried on as usual, but now she carried the knowledge that even small actions could ripple outward, changing lives in ways she could never have imagined. As the bell above the door jingled, signaling the arrival of a new customer, Aisha glanced up and smiled. She didn't know what challenges the day might bring, but she knew she had the strength to face them. If you liked this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends so they too can recognize this inspiring story, and stay tuned. There's more to come.